I've done waves before, but I've never been truly happy with how they've turned out. So I thought I'd have a go at making a truly realistic, epic ocean wave. It's hard to believe that there are people who actually sail through such monstrous seas. I've just finished watching some of the Vendée Globe round the world race, and even just watching it is enough to give me the terrors. Hopefully watching this video will be a much calmer experience. As so many of my projects do, this one started as a piece of extruded polystyrene, onto which I drew the rough shape of my wave from the top down, and then I cut this shape out with a hot wire sculpting tool from the hot wire foam factory. You can see I didn't follow the line precisely, but that's okay, this is only a rough shape. I then cut out another piece to fit on top of the other piece to start getting an idea of the three-dimensional shape of the wave. And then these two pieces were glued together using PVA glue. After the glue was mostly dry, it's best to let it dry completely, but I was impatient. I trimmed the edges using the hot wire tool. Oh, and cutting polystyrene gives off some nasty fumes, as you can see there, so it's best to wear a mask and definitely do this in a well ventilated space. Anyway, I then started cutting into the wave to give it the general shape I was after. Again, this doesn't have to be too accurate, and actually you'll have a hard job making it very accurate, because later on we'll be applying Sculptamold. I used foam offcuts to add to the wave, and then cut smaller pieces to build up the seascape. And I didn't glue these down until I'd finished carving, just in case I made a massive error or something. And once everything was glued down, I was left with a nice mess of foam like this. I made final carving touch-ups using a sharp florist's knife. Actually, it probably wasn't sharp enough and it tore the foam a bit, but I wasn't worried about that because, as I said before, the whole lot would be covered in Sculptamold anyway. I just mixed this to a relatively thick consistency so it's not too runny and so that it's not too stiff. And then I just spatulaed it over the model, filling in any gaps and smoothing over ridges, and basically working the whole piece up into a more organic shape. This doesn't have to be too smooth. I did smooth it a little bit, but it's going to be covered in watercolour paper, and a few lumps and bumps really help to create a good relief in the wave surface. In fact, I sculpted in a few more details using just Sculptamold. You can see here how I manipulated the Sculptamold to form a ridge in the wave. And after this stage is done, you really get an idea of what the wave is going to look like. I now let this dry for a day or two. Now, I've used watercolour paper in the past, and I've also used toilet tissue. Previously the watercolour paper didn't work too well because the model underneath was too up and down, by which I mean the waves were too close together, and this caused the watercolour paper to split over the top of the waves. But for this piece I wanted to use watercolour paper again because it does create a lovely texture for you to paint over, and also creases into lovely ridges ideal for realistic looking rough ocean swell. Now it's really important to give it a good soaking and apply a decent layer of Mod Podge matte or other quality white glue underneath, and then it's just a case of pressing it down over the wave, making sure that you press it into all the little gaps, and most of all being extremely patient because this does take quite a long time to mould, and you'll need to keep wetting the paper to make sure you can fit it over the wave while holding previously held down pieces in place with your other hand. In fact, I'd say I took a good hour to an hour and a half getting this to stick down. I mean, toilet paper would be so much easier, but the results are different, and it really depends what you're after. You can see I was really able to define the sharp ridges in the wave using my thumbs and my fingers. And in the end I'm very happy that I used the watercolour paper despite the effort it took. I left it for an hour or so to dry out, and then I trimmed the edges using a scalpel. Now you might want to start with a really dark blue, but I started with night blue, which sounds really dark, but in fact is just a bit darker than mid blue. And the reason for doing this is because I wanted to build up a depth of colour in the surface of the wave, and for that I decided that black wash was the best way forward, as you'll see in a moment. Now this is my homemade wash, so I'm not worried about using lots and lots of it. It's basically black acrylic ink mixed with matte medium, distilled water and a small amount of flow aid. And depending on how much ink you use in the mix, you can create different strengths of wash. This is a fairly light wash. And here again the watercolour paper comes into its own, being highly resistant to saturation. And once this wash had dried, I sealed it using some scenic glue. This is just water mixed with matte medium in a 3:1 ratio. And after letting that dry, I realised it wasn't quite dark enough, so I used some Payne's grey, which is kind of like a dark blue grey, heavily watered down, just using the water from my brush washing pot. Brushed heavily into the wave troughs and lightly up the wave sides. And after that you can see how the wash and the paint has made a really nice randomised pattern over the surface of the wave, which I wouldn't have achieved just by painting flat paint over the surface. To begin the transition to the crest of the waves, I used transparent glass paint, which when applied thinly preserved the pattern underneath. And the next colour was Lagoon, which I feathered into the green. I paid particular attention to the ridges and crests of the wave. A good blending technique can be using your finger. The first layer of water effects was Still Water by I brushed this over the entire surface of the model. One layer only took a couple of hours to dry, and after it had dried I added an extra layer to give it that beautiful glass-like shine. To sculpt the surface water, I used Sudol Fix-All crystal clear caulking. Mixed with a good slosh of isopropyl alcohol, or you could use white spirits or mineral spirits as they're called in the US, until I got a fairly thin kind of jelly paste, which I then spatulaed onto the surface of the water and carried on spreading about and manipulating and sculpting as it set up over the course of about half an hour or so. As the material stiffens up, it becomes easier to sculpt into sharp ridges and crests. Just keep working at it to avoid it slipping down into all the troughs of the wave, and to make sure that you've got a nice surface texture to the water. Having said that, I didn't cover up all of the still water as I still wanted some of that gloss to show through. For the froth and foam, I used Foam and Snow water texture by Vallejo, but you could actually use any white acrylic paint. And I started by stippling this over the crests and ridges of the wave using an old small flat brush. And then I started working down the sides of the wave, following the patterns in the water texture. To avoid harsh lines, I feathered the white out at the edges. And where I thought I'd gone too thick, I scratched at it with my thumb or the end of my paintbrush. Finer lines of web-like froth were painted on using a very fine paintbrush. Again, trying to follow the patterns created by the water texture gel. Scratching at the paint with the tip of your paintbrush can also create a really nice web-like look. And the final stage was adding more of the white paint to some neat clear caulking, mixing it together and applying this over the crests and ridges of the wave, following the direction of the wind to really accentuate the explosive white water. And that was it. Done. Finito. I was really happy with this wave. It was much more successful than my previous efforts, I felt. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks ever so much for joining me again. If you'd like monthly written tutorials for unique dioramas not shown on my YouTube channel, you might like to sign up to become a Patreon supporter. These tutorials are essentially chapters in an ongoing ebook that I'm creating, and they regularly exceed 45 pages with up to 200 photos, sometimes more, and detailed instructions throughout. Anyway, thanks for joining me. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Cheerio!